from outer space. Around 1517, Spanish colonists in the Caribbean islands began to hear vague rumors about a powerful empire somewhere in the center of the Mexican mainland. A mere 4 years later, the Aztec capital was a smoldering ruin. The Aztec Empire was a thing of the past, and Hernan Cortes lorded over a vast new Spanish empire in Mexico. The Spaniards did not stop to congratulate themselves or even to catch their breath. They immediately commenced explore and conquer operation in all directions. The previous rulers of Central America, the Aztec, the Toltecs, the Maya, barely knew South America existed and never made any attempt to subjugate it. Over the course of 2,000 years, yet within little more than 10 years of the Spanish conquest of Mexico, Francisco Pizarro had discovered the Inca Empire in South America, vanquishing it in 1532. Had the Aztecs and Incas shown a bit more interest in the world surrounding them, and had they known that what the Spaniards had done to their neighbors, they might have resisted the Spanish conquest more keenly and successfully. In the years separating Columbus' first journey to America on 1492 from the landing of Cortes in Mexico in 1519, the Spaniards conquered most of the Caribbean islands, setting up a chain of new colonies for the subjugated natives. These colonies were hell on earth. They were ruled with an iron fist by greedy and unscrupulous colonists who enslaved them and set them to work in mines and plantations, killing anyone who offered the slightest resistance. Most of the native population soon died, either because of the harsh working conditions or the virulence of the diseases that hitchhiked to America on the Conqueror sailing ships. Within 20 years, almost the entire native Caribbean population was wiped out. The Spanish colonists began importing African slaves to fill the vacuum. This genocide took place on the very doorstep of the Aztec Empire, yet when Cortes landed on the empire's eastern coast, the Aztec knew nothing about it. The coming of Spaniards was the equivalent of an island invasion from outer space. The Aztecs were convinced that they knew the entire world, that they ruled most of it. To them, it was unimaginable that outside their domain could exist anything like these Spaniards. When Cortes and his men landed on the sunny beaches of today's Veracruz, it was the first time the Aztec encountered a completely unknown people. The Aztec did not know how to react. They had trouble deciding what these strangers were. Unlike all known humans, the aliens had white skins. They also had lots of facial hair. Some had hair the color of the sun. They stank horribly. Native hygiene was far better than Spanish hygiene. When the Spaniards first arrived in Mexico, natives bearing incense burners were assigned to accompany them wherever they went. The Spaniards thought it was a mark of divine honor. We know from native sources that they found the newcomers' smell unbearable. The Aztec and Inca Empire at the time of the Spanish conquest, Spain, Caribbean island in 1492, and then the Aztec Empire in 1532 and go to Inca Empire. The island's material culture was even more bewildering. They came in giant ships, the like of which Aztecs has never imagined, let alone seen. They rode on the back of huge and terrifying animals, swift as the wind. They could produce lightning and thunder out of shiny metal sticks. They had flashing long swords and impenetrable armor, against which the native wooden swords and flint spear were useless. Some Aztec thought these must be gods, others argued that they were demons, or the ghosts of the dead, or powerful sorcerers. Instead of concentrating all available forces and whipping out the Spaniards, the Aztec deliberated, dawdled, and negotiated. They saw no reason to rush. After all, Cortés had no more than 550 Spaniards with him. What could 555 men do to an empire of millions? Cortés was equally ignorant about the Aztecs, but he and his men had significant advantages over their adversaries, while the Aztecs had no experience to prepare them for the arrival of this strange-looking and foul-smelling alliance. The Spaniards knew that the earth was full of unknown human realms, and no one had greater expertise in invading alien lands and dealing with situations about which they were utterly ignorant. For the modern European conqueror, like the modern European scientist, plunging into the unknown was exhilarating. So when Cortés anchored off that sunny beach in July 1519, he did not hesitate to act. Like a science fiction alien emerging from his spaceship, he declared to awestruck locals, "We come in peace, tickets to your leader." Cortés explained that he was a peaceful emissary from the great king of Spain and asked for a diplomatic interview with the Aztec ruler Montezuma too. This was the shameless line. Cortés led an independent expedition of greedy adventurers. The king of Spain had never heard of Cortés nor of the Aztecs. Cortés was given guides, food, and some military assistance by local enemies of the Aztecs. He then marched towards the Aztec capital, the great metropolis of Tenochtitlan. The Aztec allowed the alliance to march all the way to the capital, then respectfully led the alliance leader to meet Emperor Montezuma. In the middle of the interview, Cortés gave a signal, and steel-armed Spaniards butchered Montezuma's bodyguards, who were armed only with wooden clubs and stone blades. The honored guards took his host prisoner. Cortés was now in a very delicate situation. He had captured the emperor, but was surrounded by tens of thousands of furious enemy warriors, millions of hostile civilians, and an entire continent about which he knew practically nothing. He had at his disposal only a few hundred Spaniards, and the closest Spanish reinforcements were in Cuba, more than 1,500 kilometers away. Cortés kept Montezuma captive in the place, making it look as if the king remained free and in charge, And as if the Spanish ambassador were no more than a guest, the Aztec Empire was an extremely centralized policy, and this unprecedented situation paralyzed it. Montezuma continued to behave as if he ruled the empire, and the Aztec elite continued to obey him, which meant they obeyed Cortes. This situation lasted for several months, during which time Cortes interrogated Montezuma and his attendants, trained translators in a variety of local languages, and sent small Spanish expeditions in all directions to become familiar with the Aztec Empire and the various tribes, peoples, and cities that it ruled. The Aztec elite eventually revolted against Cortes, and Montezuma elected a new emperor and drove the Spaniards from Tenochtitlan. However, by now numerous cracks had appeared in the imperial edifice. Cortes used the knowledge he had gained to pry the cracks open wider and split the empire from within. He convinced many of the empire's subject peoples to join him against the ruling Aztec elite. The subject people miscalculated badly. Badly. They hated the Aztecs but knew nothing of Spain or the Caribbean genocide. They assumed that with Spanish help they could shake off the Aztec yoke. The idea that the Spanish would take over never occurred to them. They were sure that if Cortes and his few hundred henchmen caused any trouble, they could easily be overwhelmed. The rebellious people provided Cortes with an army of tens of thousands of local troops, and with its help Cortes besieged Tenochtitlan and conquered the city. At this stage, more and more Spanish soldiers and settlers began arriving in Mexico, some from Cuba, others all the way from Spain. When the local peoples realized what was happening, it was too late. Within the century of the landing at Veracruz, the native population of the Americas has shrunk by about 90%, due mainly to unfamiliar diseases that reached America with the invaders. The survivors found themselves under the thumbs of a greedy and racist regime that was far worse than that of the Aztecs. 10 years after Cortes landed in Mexico, Pizarro arrived on the shore of the Inca Empire. He had far fewer soldiers than Cortes. His expedition numbered just 168 men, yet Pizarro benefited from all knowledge and experience gained in previous invasions. The Inca, in contrast, knew nothing about the fate of the Aztec. Pizarro plagiarized Cortes. He declared himself peaceful and misery from the King of Spain, invited the Inca ruler Atahualpa to a diplomatic interview, and then kidnapped him. Pizarro proceeded to conquer the paralyzed empire with the help of local allies. If the subject people of the Inca Empire had known the fate of the inhabitants of Mexico, they would not have thrown in their lot of the invaders, but they did not know. The native peoples of America were not the only ones to pay a heavy price for their parochial outlook. The great empires of Asia, the Ottoman, the Safavid, the Mughal, and the Chinese, very quickly heard that Europeans had discovered something big. Yet they displayed little interest in these discoveries. They continued to believe that the world revolved around Asia and made no attempt to compete with the Europeans for control of America or of the new oceans lanes in the Atlantic and the Pacific. Even puny European kingdoms such as Scotland and Denmark sent a few explorers explore and conquer expedition to America, but not one expedition of either exploration or conquest was ever sent to America from the Islamic world, India or China. The first non-European power that tried to send a military expedition to America was Japan. That happened in June 1942 when a Japanese expedition conquered Kiska and Attu, two small islands off the Alaskan coast, capturing in the process 10 US soldiers and a dog. The Japanese never got any closer to the mainland. It's hard to argue that the Ottomans or Chinese were too far away or that they lacked the technological, economic, or military wherewithal. The resources that sent Zheng He from China to East Africa in the 1420s should have been enough to reach America. The Chinese just weren't interested. The first Chinese world map to show America was not issued until 1602, and then by a European missionary. For 300 years, Europeans enjoyed undisputed mastery in America and Oceania. In the Atlantic and the Pacific, the only significant struggles in those regions were between different European powers. The wealth and resources accumulated by the Europeans eventually enabled them to invade Asia too, defeat its empires, and divide it among themselves. When the Ottomans, Persians, Indians, and Chinese woke up and began paying attention, it was too late. Only in the 20th century did not European cultures adopt a truly global vision. This was one of the crucial factors that led to the collapse of European hegemony. Thus, in the Algerian War of Independence 1952 to 62, Algerian guerrillas defeated a French army with an overwhelming numerical, technological, and economic advantage. The Algerians prevailed because they were supported by a global anti-colonial network and because they worked out from how to harness the world's media to their cause, as well as public opinion in France itself. The defeat that little North Vietnam inflicted on American colossus was based on a similar strategy. These guerrilla forces showed that even superpowers could be defeated if a local struggle became a global cause. It is interesting to contemplate what might have happened had Montezuma been able to manipulate public opinion in Spain and gain assistance from one of Spain's rivals, Portugal, France, or the Ottoman Empire. Rare spiders and forgotten scripts. Những con nhện hiếm và những cái ghi chép bị bỏ quên. Modern science and modern empires were motivated by the restless feeling that perhaps something important awaited beyond the horizon, something they had better explore and master. Yet the connection between science and empire went much deeper. Not just the motivation, but also the practices of empire builders were entangled with those of scientists. For modern Europeans, building an empire was a scientific project, while setting up a scientific discipline was an imperial project. When the Muslims conquered India, they did not bring along archaeologists to systematically study Indian history, anthropologists to study Indian cultures, geologists to study Indian soils, anthropologists or zoologists to study Indian fauna. When the British conquered India, they did all of these things. On 10 April 1802, the Great Survey of India was launched. It It lasted 60 years with the help of tens of thousands of native laborers, scholars, and guides. The British carefully mapped the whole of India, marking borders, measuring distances, and even calculating for the first time the exact height of Mount Everest and the other Himalayan peaks. The British explored the military resources of Indian provinces and the location of their gold mines, but they also took the trouble to collect information about rare Indian spiders, to catalog colorful butterflies, to trace the ancient origins of extinct Indian languages, and to dig up for forgotten ruins. Mohenjo-daro was one of the chief cities of the Indus Valley civilization, which flourished in the 3rd millennium BC and was destroyed around 1900 BC. None of India's previous rulers, neither the Mauryas, nor the Guptas, nor the Delhi Sultans, nor the great Mughals, had given the ruins a second glance, but a British archaeological survey took notice of the site in 1922. A British team then excavated it and discovered the first great civilization of India, which no Indian had been aware of. Another telling example of British scientific curiosity was the deciphering of cuneiform script. This was the main script used throughout the Middle East for close to 3,000 years, but the last person able to read it probably died sometime in the early 1st millennium AD. Since then, inhabitants of the region frequently encounter cuneiform inscriptions on monuments, steles, ancient ruins, and broken pots, but they had no idea how to read the weird, angular scratch, and as far as we know, they never tried. Cuneiform came to the attention of Europeans in 1618 when the Spanish ambassador in Persia went sightseeing in the ruins of ancient Persepolis, where he saw inscriptions that nobody could explain to him. News of the unknown script spread among European savants and piqued their curiosity. In 1657, European scholars published the first transcription of a cuneiform text from Persepolis. More and more transcription followed, and for close to 2 centuries, scholars in the West tried to decipher them. None succeeded. In the 1830s, a British officer named Henry Rawlinson was sent to Persia to help the Shah train his army in the European style. In his spare time, Rawlinson traveled around Persia, and one day he was led by local guides to a cliff in the Zagros Mountains and shown the huge Behistun inscription, about 15 meters high and 25 meters wide. It had been etched high up on the cliff face on the command of King Darius once sometime around 500 BC. It was written in cuneiform script in 3 languages: Old Persian, Elamite, and Babylonian. The inscription was well known to the local population, but nobody could read it. Rawlinson became convinced that if he could decipher the writing, it could enable him and other scholars to read the numbered inscriptions and texts that were at the time being discovered all over the Middle East, opening a door into an ancient and forgotten world. The first step in deciphering the letter was to produce an accurate transcription that could be sent back to Europe. Rawlinson defied death to do so, scaling the steep cliff to copy the string letters. He hired several locals to help him, most notably a Kurdish boy who climbed to the most inaccessible parts of the cliff in order to copy the upper portion of the inscription. In 1847, the project was completed, and a full and accurate copy was sent to Europe. Rawlinson did not rest on his laurels. As an army officer, he had military and political missions to carry out, but whenever he had a spare moment, he puzzled over the secret script. He tried one method after another and finally managed to decipher the Old Persian parts of the inscription. This was easier, since Old Persian was not that different from modern Persian, which Rawlinson knew well. An understanding of the Old Persian section gave him the key he needed to unlock the secrets of the Elamite and Babylonian sections. The great door swung open, and out came a rush of ancient but lively voices. The bustle of Sumerian bazaars, the proclamations of Assyrian kings, the arguments of Babylonian bureaucrats, without the effort of modern European imperialists such as Rawlinson, we would not have known much about the fate of the ancient Middle East empires. Another notable imperialist scholar was William Jones. Jones arrived in India in September 1782 to serve as a judge in Supreme Court of Bengal. He was so captivated by the wonders of India that within less than 6 months of his arrival, he had founded the Asiatic Society. This academic organization was devoted to studying the cultures, histories, and societies of Asia, and in particular those of India. Within 2 years, Jones published his observations on the Sanskrit language, which pioneered the science of comparative linguistics. In his publication, Jones pointed out surprising similarity between Sanskrit and ancient Indian language that became the Shak tongue of Hindu ritual, and the Greek and Latin languages, as well as similarities between all these languages and Gothic, Celtic, Old Persian, German, French, and English. Thus, in Sanskrit, mother is mother. In Latin, it is mater, and in Old Celtic, it is mother. Jones surmised that all these languages must share a common origin, developing from a now forgotten ancient ancestors. He was thus the first to identify what later came to be called the Indo-European family of languages. Jones' study was an important milestone not merely due to his bold and accurate hypothesis, but also because of the orderly methodology that he developed to compare languages. It was adopted by other scholars, enabling them systematically to studying the development of all the world's languages. Linguistics received enthusiastic imperial support. The European empires believed that in order to govern effectively, they must know the languages and cultures of their subjects. British officers arriving in India were supposed to spend up to 3 years in a Calcutta college, where they study Hindu and Muslim law alongside English law, Sanskrit, Urdu, and Persian alongside Greek and Latin, and Tamil, Bengali, and Hindustani culture alongside mathematics, economics, and geography. The study of linguistics provided invaluable help in understanding the structure and grammar of local languages. Thanks to the work of people like William Jones and Henry Rawlinson, the European conquerors knew their empire very well, far better indeed than any previous conquerors or even than the native population itself. Their superior knowledge had obvious practical advantages. Without such knowledge, it is unlikely that a ridiculously small number of Britons could have succeeded in governing, oppressing, and exploiting so many hundreds of millions of Indians for 2 centuries. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, fewer than 500 British officials, about 40,000 to 70,000 British soldiers and perhaps another 800,000 British businesses people, hangers-on, wives and children was sufficient to conquer and rule up to 300 million Indians. Yet, these practical advantages were not the only reason why empire financed the study of linguistics, botany, geography, and history. No less important was the fact that science gave the empire's ideological justification. Modern Europeans came to believe that acquiring new knowledge was always good. The fact that the empires produced a constant stream of new knowledge branded them as progressive and positive enterprise. Even today, histories of science such as geography, archaeology, and botany cannot avoid crediting the European empires, at least indirectly. Histories of botany have little to say about the suffering of the Aboriginal Australians, but they usually find some kind words for James Cook and Joseph Banks. Furthermore, the new knowledge accumulated by the empires made it possible, at least in theory, to benefit the conquered population and bring them the benefits of progress, to provide them with medicine and education, to build railroads and canals, to ensure justice and prosperity. Imperialists claimed that their empires were not vast in enterprise of exploitation, but rather altruistic projects conducted for the sake of the non-European races. In Rudyard Kipling's words, the white man's burden. Take up the white man's burden, send forth the best ye breed. Go buy your son to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness, unflattered fork and wide. Your new-caught slaughtered peoples, half devil and half child. Oh my God! Take up the white man's burden. Send forth the bad-year breed. Go buy your son to exile, to serve your captives' need, to wait in heavy harness, unflattered fork and wide. Your new-caught slaughtered people, half devil and half child. Of course, the facts often believed in myth. The British conquered Bengal, the richest province of India, in 1764. The new rulers were interested in little except enriching themselves. They adopted a disastrous economic policy that a few years later led to the outbreaks of the Great Bengal Famine. It began in 1769, reached catastrophic levels in 1770, and lasted until 1772. About 10 million Bengalis, a third of the province's population, died in the calamity. In truth, neither the narrative of oppression and exploitation nor that of the white man's burden completely matches the fact. The European empire did so many different things on such a large scale that you can find plenty of examples to support whatever you want to say about them. If you think that these empires were evil monstrosities that spread death, oppression, and injustice around the world, you could usually find an encyclopedia with their crime. You want to argue that they in fact improved the conditions of their subjects with new medicines, better economic conditions, and greater security. You could fill another encyclopedia with their achievements. Due to their close cooperation with science, these empires wielded so much power and changed the world to such an extent that perhaps they cannot be simply labeled as good or evil. They created the world as well as we know it, including the ideologies we use in order to judge them. But science was also used by imperialists to more sinister ends. Biologists, anthropologists, and even linguists provided scientific proof that Europeans are superior to all other races and consequently have the right, if not perhaps the duty, to rule over them. Arthur William Jones argued that all Indo-European languages descend from a single ancient language. Many scholars were eager to discover who the speakers of that language had been. They noticed that the earliest Sanskrit speakers who had invaded India from Central Asia more than 3,000 years ago had called themselves Arya. The speakers of the earliest Persian language called themselves Arya. European scholars consequently surmised that the people who spoke the primordial language that gave birth to both Sanskrit and Persian, as well as to Greek, Latin, Gothic, and Celtic, must have called themselves Aryans. Could it be a coincidence that those who founded the magnificent Indian, Persian, Greek, and Roman civilization were all Aryans? Next, Buddhist, French, and German scholars wedded the linguistic theory about the industrious Aryan to Darwin's theory of natural selection and posited that the Aryans were not just a linguistic group but a biological entity, a race, and not just any race, but a master race of tall, light-haired, blue-eyed, hard-working, and super-rational humans who emerged from the midst of the North to lay the foundations of culture throughout the world. Regrettably, the Aryans who invaded India and Persia intermarried with the local natives they found in these lands, losing their light complexions and blonde hair, and with them their rationality and diligence. The civilizations of India and Persia consequently declined. In Europe, on the other hand, the Aryans preserved their racial purity. This is why Europeans had managed to conquer the world, and why they were fit to rule it, provided they took precautions not to mix with inferior races. Such racist theories, prominent and respectable for many decades, have become anathema among scientists and politicians alike. People continue to conduct a heroic struggle against racism without noticing that the battlefront has shifted, and that the place of racism in imperial ideology has now been replaced by culturalism. There is no such word, but it's about time we coined it. Among today's elites, assertions about the contrasting merits of diverse human groups are almost always couched in terms of historical differences between cultures rather than biological differences between races. We no longer say it's in their blood, we say it's in their culture. Thus, European right-wing parties which oppose Muslim immigration usually take care to avoid racial terminology. Marine Le Pen's speechwriter would have been shown the door on the spot had they suggested that the leader of the Front National go on television to declare that we don't want those inferior Semites to dilute our Aryan blood and spoil our Aryan civilization. Instead, the French Front National, the Dutch Party for Freedom, the Alliance for the Future of Australia and their like tend to argue that Western culture, as it has evolved in Europe is characterized by democratic values, tolerance, and gender equality, whereas Muslim culture, which evolved in the Middle East, is characterized by hierarch- hierarchical hierarchical politics, fanaticism, and misogyny. Since the two cultures are so different, and since many Muslim immigrants are unwilling and perhaps unable to adopt Western value, they should not be allowed to enter, lest they foment internal conflicts that corrode European democracy and liberalism. Such culturist arguments are fed by scientific studies in the humanities and social science that highlight the so-called class of civilization and the fundamental differences between different cultures. Not all historians and anthropologists accept these theories or support their political uses, but whereas biologists today have an easy time disavowing racism, simply explaining that the biological differences between present-day human population are trivial, it's harder for historians and anthropologists to disavow culturalism. After all, if the differences between human cultures are trivial, why should we pay historians and anthropologists to study them? Scientists have provided the imperial project with practical knowledge, ideological justification, and technological gadgets. Without this contribution, it's highly questionable whether Europeans could have conquered the world. The conquerors returned in favor by providing scientists with information and protection, supporting all kinds of strange and fascinating projects, and spreading the scientific way of thinking to the far corners of the earth. Without imperial support, it's doubtful whether modern science would have progressed very far. There are very few scientific disciplines that did not begin their lives as servants to imperial growth that do not own a large proportion of their discoveries, collection, buildings, and scholarships to the generous help of army officers, navy captains, and imperial governors. This is obviously not the whole story. Science was supported by other institutions, not just by empires, and the European empire rose and flourished thanks to also two factors other than science. Behind the meteoric rise of both science and empire lurks one particularly important force: capitalism. Were it not for businessmen seeking to make money, Columbus would not have reached America, James Cook would not have reached Australia, and Neil Armstrong would never have taken that small step on the surface of the moon. Okay. The capital greed. Listen to my heart.